I remember the exact moment I realized my family saw me differently than my sister. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so casual, like it meant nothing. It happened during our annual Thanksgiving dinner, the one we always had at my uncle's sprawling suburban home. I was balancing a plate of turkey and stuffing, looking for a place to sit, when my Aunt Miranda casually said, "Oh, Nathan, you'll need to sit at the folding table with the cousins this year. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I blinked, confused. I was 26 years old, with a college degree and a full-time job. My sister Eliza, who was 3 years younger than me, was already seated at the main dining table between our parents and our uncle, wineglass in hand. "Wait," I said, gesturing toward the main table where all the adults sat. "There's an empty chair right there." Aunt Miranda gave me that soft, condescending smile she'd used since I was little. "That's for Graham when she gets back from the restroom. The kids' table is just temporary until we get a bigger dining set." I looked around at the kids' table, a plastic folding table covered with a paper tablecloth, surrounded by my teenage cousins who were all engrossed in their phones. The youngest was 14. At 26, I was a decade older than any of them. "You expect me to sit with the kids?" I asked, my voice betraying my disbelief. "I'm almost 30. My Uncle Thomas sighed from his seat at the head of the main table. "It's not a big deal, Nate. We just need the space. Your sister is helping your mom with Graham during dinner, so she needs to be at the main table." I glanced at Eliza, who avoided eye contact, suddenly very interested in her cranberry sauce. My parents didn't look up either, acting as if this arrangement was perfectly normal. But it wasn't normal. For years, I'd been treated like this, as the eternal child in the family while Eliza was treated like an adult, despite being younger. I excused myself to the kitchen, plate still in hand before anyone could see the hurt on my face. I stood alone by the counter, staring at the expensive granite that I had helped my uncle install last summer when he couldn't afford professional contractors. Later, my mother came in, acting like nothing was wrong. "Sweetheart, don't make this difficult. It's just seating arrangements." "Why is Eliza at the main table when I'm stuck with the teenagers?" I asked. "Your sister has always been more mature," Mom said softly. "Family gatherings go smoother when everyone is where they fit best. Family gatherings go smoother, as long as you weren't me." I ate quickly at the kids' table, surrounded by teenagers sharing TikTok videos and complaining about school. My cousins barely acknowledged me, and why would they? I didn't belong there, and everyone knew it. Through the dining room doorway, I could see my family laughing and talking about politics, careers, and adult concerns. Eliza was animatedly discussing her new job at a marketing firm, receiving approving nods from our relatives. After dinner, when it was time for dessert, I didn't bother bringing my plate to the kitchen. I grabbed my coat and car keys instead. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, catching me at the front door. "Home," I said simply, "but we haven't had pie yet, and Thomas wants to discuss Christmas plans." I felt a cold resolve settle over me. I have work tomorrow. My father appeared behind her. "Don't be so sensitive, Nathan. It's just a seating arrangement." But it wasn't just a seating arrangement. It was years of being treated as less than, of having my opinions dismissed, of being the reliable one who was never quite respected. I drove home to my apartment that night, the radio silent as I replayed years of similar moments in my mind. For as long as I could remember, Eliza had been the golden child, her accomplishments celebrated, her opinions valued, her presence desired. I was the reliable one, the one who showed up when needed, but was otherwise an afterthought. When I was 16 and made honor roll, my parents gave a perfunctory good job. When Eliza made honor roll 2 years later, they took the family out to celebrate at an expensive restaurant. When I graduated college, my parents attended but left early to prepare for Eliza's birthday the next day. When Eliza graduated, they threw her a party and gifted her a car. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. I knew they did, in their way. It was more that they had unconsciously decided long ago which child was worth investing in emotionally, which one was worth showcasing to the extended family, which one was the future, and which one was just there. I spent that night in my apartment staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe it really was just a seating arrangement. Maybe I was being sensitive, as my father had suggested. But deep down, I knew better. It was a symptom of something much larger, something that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. The next morning, I woke to 3 missed calls from my mother and a text that read, "We missed you at dessert. Call me when you're less upset." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I didn't call back. Not that day, not the next. Days turned into weeks. I missed the usual Sunday family dinners. I declined the invitation to my cousin's birthday party. I made excuses for Christmas. With each refusal, I expected someone to notice, to ask what was really wrong, to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, I had a point. No one did. My mother's texts became increasingly terse. "Your absence is noticed. Your sister is asking about you. Your father thinks you're being childish." I focused on my work at the architectural firm, volunteering for weekend projects, staying late to refine designs, anything to keep my mind occupied. I hadn't taken a real vacation in years, always saving my leave for family emergencies or helping relatives move or attending distant cousins' weddings. Now, I used that time for myself. Christmas came and went. I sent gifts, made a brief appearance on Christmas Eve, and left before the main dinner. My family acted surprised by my distance, but not concerned enough to really address it. My sister cornered me before I left. "What's your problem lately?" she asked, arms crossed in the hallway. "Nothing," I replied, zipping up my coat. "Just busy with work." "Is this still about Thanksgiving? About sitting with the kids?" She looked genuinely confused. "That's such a small thing to be upset about." I paused, hand on the doorknob. "It's not about where I sat, Eliza. It's about what it represents." "Which is what?" she challenged. I sighed. "If you don't already see it, I don't think I can explain it to you." And I left, driving back to my empty apartment, where at least the silence was honest. January brought snow and the annual family financial discussion. For years, I'd contributed to the Family Emergency Fund, a pool of money my parents had established to help family members in need. I had put in more than my share, often sacrificing my own comfort to ensure the fund was healthy. As far as I knew, Eliza had never contributed a dime, despite her higher-paying job and nicer apartment. The discussion happened without me this year. I simply didn't show up. 2 days later, my father called. "You didn't send your contribution," he said without preamble. "I know," I replied, looking out my apartment window at the snow-covered street below. "We've always counted on you for this, Nathan. Everyone does their part." "Do they?" I asked. "Does Eliza contribute?" There was a pause. "Your sister helps in other ways." "Of course she did." "I'm taking a step back from family financial obligations this year," I said with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. "I'm saving for my own place." "This is very disappointing," my father said, his voice hardening. "We rely on you to be responsible." After we hung up, I sat with the weight of that word, responsible. That's how they saw me. Not as impressive or special or valued, just responsible. The reliable one who would always say yes, who would always put family first, who would never complain about being seated with children while his younger sister was treated like royalty. For the first time in my adult life, I began to truly evaluate my relationship with my family. I started therapy, something I had never considered before. My therapist, Dr. Chen, asked questions no one had ever asked me. Why do you think your family treats you and your sister differently? How long have you noticed this pattern? What would equitable treatment look like to you? I didn't have easy answers, but the questions themselves were illuminating. They forced me to confront patterns I had accepted as normal for decades. February arrived with a sudden family crisis. My grandmother fell and broke her hip, requiring surgery and full-time care during recovery. The family group chat exploded with discussions of who would help and how. I read the messages but didn't respond. Eventually, my mother called directly. "Nathan, we need to discuss Graham's care schedule." "Okay," I said neutrally. "We need you to take the overnight shifts Tuesday through Friday. Your sister can't because of her work presentations, and your father and I are too old to be up all night." I took a deep breath. "I can't do that, Mom. I have work too." The silence on the other end was deafening. "What do you mean you can't? This is your grandmother." "I understand that, but I have deadlines. I can help on weekends." "Weekends aren't enough, Nathan. This is family. This is what we do for each other." I closed my eyes, thinking of all the times I'd rearranged my life to accommodate family needs while others made excuses. "I'm sorry, but weekends are all I can offer right now." My mother's voice turned cold. "I never thought you'd be the type to abandon family when they need you." After we hung up, I sat motionless in my apartment, heart racing. I had never said no to a family obligation before. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, but underneath it, something else stirred, a sense of self-preservation I'd neglected for too long. The family found another solution for Graham's care, a night nurse covered by insurance that apparently no one had bothered to check before calling me. My contribution wasn't as indispensable as they'd made it seem. This revelation was both hurtful and freeing. March brought an unexpected twist. My Uncle Thomas called me directly, which was unusual. We had always been cordial, but not particularly close. "Nathan, I was hoping we could meet for lunch," he said. "Just the two of us." Curious and slightly suspicious, I agreed. We met at a steakhouse near my office. After ordering, he got straight to the point. "I'm expanding my business," he said, cutting into his ribeye. "Opening a second location." "Congratulations," I replied, genuinely impressed. My uncle ran a successful home renovation company. "I need investors," he continued, "family investors who understand the business. I remembered you mentioned having savings for a down payment on a house." I nearly choked on my water. "You want me to invest my house savings in your business expansion?" He nodded enthusiastically. "It's a guaranteed return, Nathan. Family. Taking care of family." "Did you ask Eliza to invest?" I couldn't help asking. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Your sister has her career to focus on, and you've always been good with money, reliable." There it was again, reliable, the code word for the family doormat. "I'll think about it," I said, knowing already what my answer would be. On the drive back to work, I called my sister. "Did Uncle Thomas ask you to invest in his business?" I asked when she answered. "What?" "No," she said, sounding puzzled. "What business?" I explained briefly about the expansion. "That's weird," she said. "He was just telling me last week how risky the current economic climate is for expansion. Said he was holding off on new ventures for at least a year." I felt a cold clarity wash over me. He had lied, either to me or to Eliza. Given the family pattern, I could guess which one of us had received the honest assessment. The frequency of family requests increased over the next few weeks, as if they sensed my growing distance and were trying to pull me back into the fold. My mother needed help with her computer. My father's car needed repairs. My aunt wanted assistance planning a surprise party for my uncle. Each request was phrased with the same underlying assumption that I would say yes, that my time was less valuable, that I existed to support the family infrastructure. For the first time, I began saying no, not to everything, but to enough. Each refusal felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. April arrived, bringing with it a significant work opportunity, a chance to lead a major project that would mean a promotion if successful. I threw myself into it, working longer hours than ever before. My apartment became a secondary office, blueprints and models replacing what little decor I had. My absence from family functions became the new normal. I still called my parents weekly, still checked on my grandmother, still sent birthday cards, but I no longer oriented my life around family needs and expectations. Then came the day everything changed again. It was a Sunday afternoon in late April. I was working on project renderings when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my entire immediate family, mother, father, sister, and grandmother, standing in the hallway. "Intervention," my sister said with a half smile, pushing past me into the apartment. The others followed. I stood stunned as they made themselves comfortable in my living room, eyeing the work materials spread across every surface. "We're worried about you," my mother began. "You've been distant, preoccupied." "I'm focusing on work," I explained, moving some blueprints to make room for them to sit. "I have a big project. Family should come first," my father said firmly. "You've always understood that before." I took a deep breath. "I'm trying to build my own life." "You have a life," my mother insisted. "With us, with your family." "A life where I sit at the kids' table at 26? The words escaped before I could stop them. My family exchanged glances. My grandmother looked confused. "Is that what this is about? Thanksgiving seating?" "It's about what it represents," I said, echoing my words to Eliza months earlier. "And what's that?" my father challenged. I looked at each of them. These people I loved despite everything. These people who had shaped me in ways both good and damaging. "It's about the fact that I've never been treated like an adult in this family," I said quietly. "It's about being reliable enough to contribute financially and help with every crisis, but not important enough to sit with the adults. It's about Eliza being treated like royalty while I'm treated like the help." The room fell silent. My sister's face flushed red. "That's not fair," she protested. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time you contributed to the family emergency fund? When was the last time you were asked to drop everything for a family crisis? When was the last time someone in this family celebrated your accomplishments the way they celebrate Eliza's?" My mother's lips thinned to a line. "We've always been fair." "No," I said, feeling a strange calm. "You haven't. And the worst part is, you don't even see it." "So this is why you've abandoned your family commitments?" my father asked. "Out of jealousy?" I shook my head. "Not jealousy. Self-preservation." My grandmother, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I think Nathan has a point." All heads turned to her in surprise. "I've watched how differently you treat these two," she continued, looking at my parents. "I never said anything because it wasn't my place. But the boy's right. You expect everything from him and nothing from her." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "That's not true. We love them both equally." "Love isn't the issue," I said gently. "It's respect. It's recognition. It's being treated like my time and needs matter too." The conversation that followed was long and painful. There were tears, accusations, denials. My sister vacillated between defensive anger and genuine confusion. My parents seemed unable to see the patterns that were so obvious to me. In the end, We reached no real resolution, just an exhausted truce. They left with promises to think about what I'd said, though I had little hope that real change would come. Decades of family dynamics don't shift in a single afternoon. But something had changed, not in them, but in me. I had finally spoken my truth after years of silent acceptance. I had named the inequality that had shaped our family, had shaped me. Whether they recognized it or not, I could no longer unsee it. The weeks that followed were quiet. My family kept their distance, perhaps processing, perhaps simply avoiding the uncomfortable truths I'd raised. I focused on my project, pouring all my energy into creating something that was entirely mine. May brought a breakthrough at work. My project design was selected as the final concept, earning me the promotion I'd been working toward. For the first time in my career, I felt truly recognized for my talents and efforts. I shared the news with a few close friends but didn't tell my family immediately. Some part of me feared they would diminish this achievement as they had so many others. When I finally did call my parents to share the news, their response was predictably lukewarm. "That's nice, dear," my mother said. "Will this mean more money? Because your uncle's business investment opportunity is still open." I laughed, not bitterly, but with genuine amusement at the predictability of it all. "No, Mom," I said. "My savings are still for my house down payment." "Well, family should help family," she replied. "Remember how much your uncle has done for you." After hanging up, I felt oddly at peace. Their response hadn't hurt me as it once would have. I no longer needed their validation to know my worth. June arrived with its early summer heat and a family announcement. Uncle Thomas's business was in trouble. Not the expansion he'd asked me to invest in, but the original business itself. Bad investments, market downturns, and mismanagement had left him on the verge of bankruptcy. An emergency family meeting was called. I attended out of curiosity more than obligation. The gathering was held at my parents' house. Everyone crowded into the living room with its outdated furniture and faded family photos. Uncle Thomas looked haggard, Aunt Miranda tearful. They explained the situation in vague terms: economic challenges, unexpected setbacks, temporary cash flow issues. What became clear through the euphemisms was that they needed money, and they needed it fast. "How much?" my father asked. "50,000 to keep the creditors at bay," Uncle Thomas replied. "Just until things turn around." My parents exchanged worried glances. They were comfortable but not wealthy. 50,000 would be a significant portion of their retirement savings. "We can contribute 10, my father finally said. All eyes turned to me. Not to Eliza, not to other relatives present. To me. "Nathan," my uncle said, using a warmth I hadn't heard from him in years. "You've always been so good with money, so responsible." I met his gaze steadily. I am good with money. That's why I don't invest in failing businesses. The room fell, silent. My uncle's face reddened. "This isn't a failing business. It's a temporary setback." "Then a bank should be willing to give you a loan," I replied. "Banks don't understand family businesses," he countered. "They don't care about anything but numbers." "Maybe they're on to something," I said quietly. My mother gasped. "Nathan." I stood up, suddenly tired of the charade. "I'm not investing in Uncle Thomas's business, not because I don't care about family, but because it would be throwing good money after bad. And frankly, I find it interesting that I'm suddenly important enough to ask for money, but not important enough to sit at the adult table." "Are you still on about that?" my aunt snapped. "That was months ago." "Yes," I agreed. "Just like the pattern of treating me like an ATM while treating me like a child has been going on for years." I left soon after, ignoring the calls of responsibility and family obligation that followed me to the door. For once, I felt neither guilt nor uncertainty. I had made the right decision for myself, regardless of family pressure. The fallout was predictable. My mother called daily, alternating between guilt trips and anger. My father was more direct. I was selfish. I was abandoning the family in their time of need. Even Eliza reached out, though her approach was more measured. "I get that you feel undervalued," she said during one call. "But this is bigger than that. Uncle Thomas could lose everything." "That's unfortunate," I replied. "But it's not my responsibility to save him from his own bad decisions." "So, you're just going to let the family suffer because your feelings were hurt at Thanksgiving?" she asked incredulously. I sighed. "No, Eliza. I'm choosing not to sacrifice my financial future for someone who has never shown me basic respect. There's a difference." July brought a turning point. My uncle's business did indeed fail, forcing him and my aunt to sell their house and move into a small rental. The family rallied around them, providing emotional support and some financial assistance, though nowhere near the amount they had hoped to raise. My absence from these efforts was noted and commented upon. I became, in family discussions, the cautionary tale of selfishness, of forgetting where you came from, of putting yourself above family. I continued to build my own life. The promotion came with a significant raise, allowing me to accelerate my savings for a house. I expanded my social circle, joining a local architectural society and a weekend hiking group. I started dating more. Seriously, no longer organizing my schedule around family obligations. By August, I had enough saved for a modest down payment. I began house hunting, focusing on small homes in up-and-coming neighborhoods. The process was both exciting and terrifying. I had never made such a significant purchase before, had never truly established myself as separate from my family of origin. It was during this search that I received an unexpected call from my grandmother. She rarely called directly, usually communicating through my parents. "Nathan," she said when I answered, "I'd like to see you. Alone." Intrigued, I agreed to visit her the following weekend. She lived in a small but comfortable apartment in a senior living community, having sold her house after my grandfather's death years earlier. When I arrived, she was waiting with tea and cookies, just as she had when I was a child visiting her home. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to an armchair across from her. "We need to talk." I obeyed, accepting the cup of tea she pushed toward me. "You're buying a house," she stated. Not a question. "Trying to," I confirmed. "The market is competitive." She nodded, studying me with eyes still sharp despite her age. "Your parents think you're being selfish." I sighed. "I know." "They're wrong," she said simply. I nearly choked on my tea. "What?" "They're wrong," she repeated. "I've watched for years as they've treated you and your sister differently. I said nothing because it wasn't my place, but I'm too old now to stay silent when I see injustice." I set my cup down carefully. "Thank you for saying that." She waved away my thanks. "I'm not finished. Your parents, your uncle, even your sister, they've taken advantage of your good nature. They call it responsibility, but what they mean is compliance. They expect you to sacrifice without recognition, because that's the role they assigned, you." Her bluntness was shocking but validating in a way I couldn't articulate. "However," she continued, fixing me with a stern look, "family is still family. When you cut them off completely, you lose something precious too." "I haven't cut them off," I protested. "I just stopped being available for everything they ask." She nodded. "Good. Balance is what you need. Not estrangement, not doormat status. Balance." She reached for her purse, which sat beside her chair, and removed an envelope. "This is for you," she said, passing it to me. Inside was a check for $20,000. "Graham, I can't accept this," I said immediately. "Yes, you can," she replied firmly. "I've given similar gifts to your sister over the years, helped with her car, her first apartment security deposit, that trip to Europe she took after college. You never asked, so you never received. That was my mistake. I stared at the check, emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to refuse it on principle. I didn't need their financial support to prove my worth. But another part recognized this for what it was. Not charity, but an acknowledgement of inequality, an attempt to balance scales long tipped against me. Use it for your house, she said. Build something that's yours, something no one can take away from you or make you feel small within. I carefully folded the check and put it in my wallet. Thank you. One more thing, she said, her expression softening. They're having another family dinner next Sunday. Your uncle and aunt will be there. They're still struggling. Graham, I'm not giving them money, I said firmly. She chuckled. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying you should come. Hold your head high. Take your seat at the adult table, and if anyone suggests otherwise, you tell them your grandmother insists. I smiled, genuinely touched by her fierce support. I'll think about it. I decided to attend the family dinner, not out of obligation but to reclaim my space. When I arrived, everyone seemed surprised to see me, their expressions a mixture of wariness and hope. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Miranda were particularly uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact as I hung my coat in the hallway. The dining room was set as always, the main table elegantly appointed with my mother's best china and crystal glasses, the folding table in the corner covered with a paper tablecloth. My cousin Lily, now 15, was already seated at the kids' table, engrossed. In her phone, I walked directly to the main table and pulled out an empty chair. Oh, Nathan, my mother said quickly. We've already arranged the seating. I'm sitting here, I stated calmly, not as a challenge but as a simple fact. My grandmother, who had just entered from the kitchen, smiled. Yes, he is. Nathan sits with the adults now. No one argued. My mother's lips thinned with disapproval, but she said nothing further. I took my seat, feeling a small but significant victory as everyone adjusted to this new reality. Dinner was tense at first. Conversation? Stilted and careful. No one mentioned Uncle Thomas's failed business or my refusal to invest. Instead, they discussed safe topics, neighborhood news, an upcoming wedding, the unusually hot summer. When it was time for dessert, my aunt finally addressed me directly. How's work, Nathan? She asked, her voice overly bright. Miranda. Tells me you got a promotion. I did, I confirmed. I'm leading the design team for the new library downtown. That sounds nice, she said, clearly struggling to show interest in my career when she'd never bothered before. My uncle cleared his throat. Libraries are important community resources, he offered awkwardly. I nodded, recognizing their efforts, however clumsy, to engage with me on adult terms. It was a start, though I harbored no illusions that one dinner would fundamentally change patterns established over decades. After dessert, as everyone moved to the living room for coffee, my sister pulled me aside in the hallway. Can we talk? She asked, gesturing toward the back porch. Outside, the summer evening was warm and fragrant with my mother's roses. Eliza paced a few steps, clearly uncomfortable. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. About how differently we've been treated. I waited, letting her find her words. At first, I thought you were just being dramatic, she continued. But then I started paying attention and... She looked directly at me. You're right. They do treat us differently. They always have. Her acknowledgement was unexpected and surprisingly powerful. For so long, I had felt gaslit by my family's denial of what seemed obvious to me. Why do you think it happened that way? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. She shrugged, leaning against the porch railing. I think maybe you were just so capable from such a young age. You never seemed to need as much attention or help. I was the emotional one, the one who made a fuss. So they rewarded the squeaky wheel, I observed without bitterness. Maybe, she conceded. Or maybe they just didn't understand what you needed because you never demanded it. She paused. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Her apology wasn't a solution to years of inequality, but it was something, recognition, validation from the person who had most benefited from the imbalance in our family. Thank you for saying that, I replied simply. We stood in silence for a moment, the sound of cicadas filling the night air. I heard you're buying a house, she said eventually. Looking, I corrected. Nothing firm yet. She nodded. That's amazing, Nate. Really. You've always been better at planning than me. It was a small compliment, but felt genuine. We talked a bit longer about her job, about my house search, about neutral topics that allowed us to navigate this new, more equal terrain between us. When we returned inside, the family dynamic felt subtly shifted, nothing dramatic, but a small recalibration that acknowledged my new position. I was no longer automatically relegated to the background, no longer just reliable Nathan who existed to fulfill family needs. The weeks following that dinner marked a gradual change in how I approached family relationships. I didn't cut ties, as Graham had cautioned against, but I maintained clear boundaries. I attended Sunday dinners occasionally, not weekly. I contributed to family events when I could, but didn't rearrange my schedule automatically. I shared my successes and received, if not enthusiastic celebration, at least acknowledgement. By late September, I had found a house, a modest two-bedroom bungalow in a neighborhood with large trees and quiet streets. It needed work, but the bones were good, and the price was within my budget, especially with Graham's generous gift. The closing process was straightforward, and before I knew it, I was standing in my own living room, keys in hand, surrounded by echoing space and possibility. That first night in the empty house, sitting on a folding chair with takeout balanced, on my knees I felt a profound sense of achievement. This was mine. Earned through my work, my savings, my persistence. No one could tell me where to sit here, or how to be, or what was expected of me. In this space, I made the rules. I had expected to feel lonely in those first few days, but instead, I felt liberated. Each decision, from paint colors to furniture placement, was mine alone. I discovered preferences I hadn't known I had, freed from the constant subtle pressure to accommodate others' expectations. I painted the living room a bold blue that my mother would have called too dark, but that felt rich and calming to me. I arranged my workspace near the windows instead of tucked in a corner as I'd always done in my apartment. I planted herbs in the small backyard, something I'd always wanted to try but never had space for. My parents visited the house a week after I moved in. Their reaction was predictably lukewarm. It's very simple, my mother observed, running a finger along the counter I'd just installed. The neighborhood seems transitional, my father added, peering through the windows at my perfectly ordinary street. I like it, I said, not defensively, but with quiet confidence. It suits me. They exchanged a glance I couldn't quite interpret. Concern, perhaps, or simply adjustment to this new version of me who didn't seek their approval. Well, when you're ready to upgrade, let me know, my father said. I know a good realtor who specializes in more established neighborhoods. I smiled, recognizing the comment not as criticism, but as his awkward way of trying to be helpful, to connect in the only way he knew how. I'll keep that in mind. As they were leaving, my mother paused in the doorway. It's very you, she said, and for once there was no condescension in her tone, just a simple observation. It feels like you. Coming from her, it was high praise. October brought new challenges at work, with the library project entering a critical phase. I spent long hours at the office, coming home late to my half-furnished house, too tired to do more than heat up leftovers and fall into bed. One particularly exhausting Thursday, I arrived home to find a small group gathered on my front porch. My grandmother, my sister, and, surprisingly, Aunt Miranda. "Intervention," Eliza said with a small smile, echoing her words from months earlier, but this time with warmth rather than challenge. They had brought dinner, proper chairs to replace my folding ones, and a housewarming gift, a handmade quilt from my grandmother. "Every home needs something made with love," Graham said as I unwrapped it. As we ate at my new but still unfinished dining table, Aunt Miranda cleared her throat awkwardly. "I owe you an apology," she said, setting down her fork. "Thomas and we took advantage of your generosity over the years. We assumed you would always say yes." Her directness surprised me. Of all my relatives, I had expected her to be the last to acknowledge the family pattern. "We're starting over now," she continued. Smaller house, Thomas working for someone else for the first time in 20 years. It's been humbling. I nodded, not sure what response she was looking for. "The thing is," she went on, "humbling isn't always bad. Sometimes it makes you see things clearly for the first time." She looked me in the eye. "You were right to refuse the investment. The business was already failing. Thomas just couldn't admit it." Her honesty was unexpected and strangely healing. Not because I needed to be proven right, but because it acknowledged a reality my family had spent so long denying, that their expectations of me had been unfair, that their perception of me had been limited. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. The evening shifted into something more relaxed after that, not perfect, not without the occasional awkward moment or old pattern emerging, but different, more equal, more honest. When they left, Eliza lingered behind. "Can I help with anything this weekend?" she asked. "With the house, I mean. I'm not great with tools, but I can paint." Her offer was a small thing, but significant, a reversal of the usual family dynamic where I was the one expected to help everyone else. "Actually," I said, "I'm putting up shelves in the spare room Saturday. An extra pair of hands would be..." "Good," she smiled. "I'll bring coffee." True to her word, Eliza arrived Saturday morning with coffee and pastries. She was as hopeless with tools as she'd warned, but she held things steady while I measured and drilled, handed me screws when needed, and kept me company as we worked. "I never realized how capable you are at this stuff," she observed as I mounted the final bracket. "You just know how to do everything." I shrugged. "Not everything. I just learned what I needed to." "Still," she insisted, "it's impressive. I wouldn't even know where to start." Her compliment was genuine, and I felt a warm glow of recognition, not just for my practical skills, but for me as a whole person, not just the family utility player. As we cleaned up, she mentioned casually, "Mom and Dad's anniversary is next month. 40 years. I nodded, sorting screws back into their container. "I remember." "I thought maybe we could do something for them," she continued. "Together, I mean. Split the cost, split the planning." In the past, such an event would have fallen entirely to me, the organizing, the execution, often most of the cost as well. Eliza's suggestion of an equal partnership was new territory. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Nothing extravagant," she said quickly, perhaps sensing my hesitation. "Maybe a nice dinner, some kind of meaningful gift. I'm not asking you to bankroll a big party or anything." Her clarification showed an awareness of past patterns that I appreciated. "That sounds doable," I agreed. "Let's think about it and talk next week." She beamed, clearly pleased by my agreement. "Perfect. And Nate? Thanks for letting me help today. It's nice, spending time like this." After she left, I stood in the newly shelved room, feeling a subtle shift in our sibling dynamic. Not a complete transformation, but the beginning of something more balanced, more reciprocal. November arrived with colder weather and a call from my Uncle Thomas. Unlike Aunt Miranda, he had maintained his distance since his business failure, pride perhaps preventing him from facing me directly. "Nathan," he said, his voice gruff when I answered. "Got a minute?" "Sure," I replied, curious about this unexpected contact. "I'm working for Dawson Construction now," he said without preamble, "managing smaller projects." "That's good," I said, unsure where this was heading. "They're looking for an architectural consultant on some residential projects," he continued. "Nothing fancy but steady work. I mentioned your name." I was silent for a moment, processing this unexpected development. My uncle was offering a professional connection, treating me as a peer rather than just a convenient source of financial support. "If you're interested," he added awkwardly, "I could set up a meeting." "No pressure. They're just good people to know in the industry." "I'd appreciate that," I said, genuinely surprised by his offer. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he replied with a hint of his old humor. "Dawson's a tough boss, but fair." After we hung up, I sat contemplating this new development. My uncle's gesture wasn't an explicit apology, but it was an acknowledgement of my professional worth, a way of making amends that respected rather than diminished me. The meeting with Dawson Construction led to a small consulting contract. Nothing that would interfere with my primary job, but an interesting side opportunity that could eventually lead to more independent work. When I shared the news with my parents during Sunday dinner, their reaction was surprisingly positive. "That's wonderful," my mother said, with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Thomas speaks very highly of Mr. Dawson." "Residential work can be lucrative long-term," my father added, nodding approvingly. "Good stability there." "They're positive?" Response felt unfamiliar, but welcome. Another small step toward being seen for who I was, rather than who they had decided I should be. As Thanksgiving approached, the anniversary of the kids' table incident that had catalyzed so much change, I found myself increasingly reflective. The past year had transformed not just how my family treated me, but how I saw myself. I was no longer passively accepting the role assigned to me, no longer measuring my worth by others' recognition or lack thereof. My house was coming together, room by room. My career was advancing in ways I hadn't anticipated. My relationships, while still imperfect, had evolved toward greater authenticity and respect. The week before Thanksgiving, my mother called to discuss arrangements. "We'll be at Thomas and Miranda's this year," she said. "They're in a smaller place now, so space is tight." I felt a moment of tension, wondering if history was about to repeat itself. "We thought you might bring those folding chairs from your garage," she continued. "The nice wooden ones you refinished." I hesitated. "Mom, I'm not sitting at a folding table this year." There was a pause, then a sound that surprised me. Laughter. "Oh, Nathan, of course not," she said. "We need the chairs for the main table. There's not enough seating for everyone otherwise." The assumption that I would be at the main table, that it didn't even need to be stated, marked a subtle but significant shift in family dynamics. "I'll bring the chairs," I agreed, smiling despite myself. "And maybe that spinach dip you made for the 4th of July?" she added. Everyone loved it. It was a small thing, being asked to contribute food I had prepared rather than just practical items or financial support, but it acknowledged me as a whole person with multiple ways to add value. "Sure," I said. "I can do that." On Thanksgiving Day, I arrived at Uncle Thomas and Aunt Miranda's new home, a modest ranch-style house in a quiet neighborhood, significantly smaller than their previous residence, but warm and welcoming. The dining arrangement was immediately apparent. One large table extended through the living room into the dining area, with place settings for all the adults and older teenagers. The younger children had a small table in the adjacent kitchen nook, supervised by my cousin's teenage daughter. My name card was placed between my grandmother and my cousin's husband, a position of neither special prominence nor relegation, simply one adult family member among many. The normalcy of it was its own victory. Before we sat down, Uncle Thomas pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "For the chairs?" I asked, deliberately misunderstanding. He shook his head. "For not investing in the business. You were right. It was already failing. If you had put money in, you'd have lost it all." His acknowledgement was unexpected and powerful, not just admission of financial misjudgment, but recognition of my judgment, my perspective that had been so readily dismissed. "I appreciate that," I said simply. And, he added with visible effort, "I'm sorry for how we've treated you over the years, taking you for granted, assuming you'd always be the one to step up without recognition." He gestured around the smaller home. It took losing a lot to realize what really matters. His apology wasn't dramatic or effusive, but it was sincere, man to man, adult to adult, without condescension or evasion. As we gathered around the table, my grandmother caught my eye and gave me a small, satisfied nod. She had seen the inequality long before I had found the courage to name it, had supported my stand in her quiet but firm way. The meal wasn't perfect. Old patterns occasionally surfaced, old tensions flickered and faded. But it was different. More equal, more authentic. When it came time for the traditional going around the table expressions of gratitude, I found myself genuinely thankful not just for the material aspects of my life, the job, the house, the stability, but for the hard-won self-respect that had come from standing my ground, from refusing to be less than I was capable of being. "I'm grateful for growth," I said when my turn came. "For change. For second chances." My grandmother reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with understanding and pride. In that moment, surrounded by my imperfect but evolving family, I felt something I had rarely experienced in family gatherings before. A sense of truly belonging, not as an accessory or a utility, but as an essential, respected part of the whole. The journey wasn't complete. Family patterns built over decades don't transform overnight. But the direction was clear. I had changed, and in changing myself, had changed how others could interact with me. The kids' table was behind me, not just physically but metaphorically, and ahead lay something I was only beginning to explore. A life where I defined my own worth, set my own boundaries, and created my own place at whatever table I chose to join. The winter holidays passed. With a new sense of equilibrium in my family, Christmas at my parents' home featured none of the usual subtle hierarchies, no special gifts lavished on Eliza while I received practical items, no automatic assumption that I would handle all the cleanup while others relaxed. Instead, there was a tentative but genuine attempt at equity. My father asked about my consulting work with actual interest. My mother sought my opinion on redecorating their living room, valuing my design knowledge for perhaps the first time. It wasn't perfect. Decades of ingrained habits don't vanish overnight, but it was progress. I found myself able to enjoy family gatherings without the constant undercurrent of resentment that had once colored every interaction. January arrived with freezing temperatures and an unexpected opportunity. Mr. Dawson, impressed by my consulting work, approached me with a proposition over coffee one bitterly cold morning. "I've been watching how you approach projects," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "You've got something most architects lack: practical understanding of construction challenges, technical skill combined with real-world knowledge." I nodded my thanks, unsure where he was heading. "I'm looking to expand the business," he continued, moving beyond basic residential into more creative territory, custom designs, environmentally conscious buildings, that sort of thing. He looked at me directly. "I need a partner who can lead that division, someone with vision and practical sense. A partner? I repeated, making sure I'd understood correctly. Junior partner initially, he clarified. You'd have creative control of your projects with my financial backing and construction expertise. Profit-sharing arrangement. After 2 years, we reevaluate for possible equal partnership. The offer was stunning. A chance to build something that was truly mine while leveraging resources I couldn't access alone. It would mean leaving my secure position at the architectural firm, taking a risk at 30 that most in my profession wouldn't consider until mid-career. I'll need time to think about it, I said carefully. Dawson nodded, unsurprised. Take a week. But I should mention, I made the same offer to 2 others before you. Both turned it down, said it was too risky. He grinned. Their loss, potentially your gain. That evening, I sat in my newly finished study, weighing the opportunity against the security of my current position. The old Nathan would have automatically chosen safety, the known quantity, the predictable path. But I wasn't that person anymore. I called Graham, whose practical wisdom had guided me through the past year. It sounds promising, she said after I explained the situation. Dawson has a solid reputation. It's a risk, I countered. No guaranteed salary, just project percentages. Yes, she agreed. A risk with potential for significant reward. The question isn't whether it's risky, Nathan. The question is whether you wanted enough to accept the risk. Her framing clarified something for me. This wasn't just about financial calculations or career advancement. It was about what kind of life I wanted to build, one defined by careful safety or one that made space for bold vision. I think I do, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Then you have your answer, she replied simply. The next day, I gave notice at my firm. My supervisor was shocked. I had always been the reliable one, the team player who never rocked the boat. You're making a mistake, he warned as I cleared out my desk. Partnerships with builders are notoriously unstable. Maybe, I acknowledged. But it's my mistake to make. Those words stayed with me as I drove to my parents' house that evening to share my decision. I found them in the kitchen, my mother preparing dinner while my father sorted through mail at the counter. I've accepted a partnership offer with Dawson Construction, I announced without preamble. I'm leaving the firm next month. My father looked up sharply. Thomas's boss? The builder? I nodded, bracing for the criticism I expected. That I was being impulsive, that I was throwing away security, that I hadn't thought it through. Instead, my father set down the mail and regarded me thoughtfully. Interesting move. High risk, high reward potential. That's exactly what I was thinking, I said, slightly thrown by his measured response. Will you be working with Thomas directly? My mother asked, pausing in her food preparation. Occasionally, I said. He runs the standard residential division. I'll be developing a new custom design division. My father nodded slowly. Bold step. Different from what I would choose, but... He hesitated, then added, You've always had good judgment, even when we didn't recognize it. The acknowledgement, simple as it was, felt monumental. Recognition not just of my decision, but of my capacity to make decisions, to chart my own course without their guidance or approval. Thank you, I said, the words inadequate for the shift they represented. My mother wiped her hands on a towel, her expression a mix of concern and something newer, respect, perhaps. It will be an adjustment, I imagine, if you need anything. I'll be fine, I assured her, then added with a smile, but I appreciate the offer. That night, driving home through the quiet winter streets, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with my family had evolved. A year ago, I would have agonized over their reaction to such a decision, might even have declined the opportunity rather than risk their disapproval. Now, their opinion remained important to me, but it no longer defined my choices. February brought my first official project as Dawson's partner, redesigning an old warehouse into a mixed-use space with apartments, offices, and retail. The budget was tight, the timeline aggressive, but the creative freedom was intoxicating. For the first time, my name would be prominently featured as the lead architect, not buried in a list of team members. I threw myself into the work, spending long hours at the drafting table in my home office, walls covered with sketches and material samples. The project consumed me in the best possible way, challenging every skill I possessed while allowing me to express ideas I'd kept bottled up for years. One evening, as I worked late into the night, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened it to find Eliza on my porch, holding a paper bag. "Thought you might be forgetting to eat," she said, pushing past me into the house. "I brought sandwiches from that deli you like." She stopped short in the living room, which I had converted into a temporary project space with models and drawings covering every surface. "Wow," she said, taking it all in. "This is intense." "First major solo project," I explained, clearing space on the coffee table for the food. "Warehouse conversion downtown." She studied the model I had built, circling it with genuine interest. "This is amazing, Nate. I had no idea you could do something like this." Her admiration wasn't patronizing or performative. It was the real recognition of one adult for another's talents and accomplishments. We ate sandwiches amid my creative chaos, talking about the project, about her work, about neutral topics that had nothing to do with family dynamics or past grievances. It felt normal in a way our interactions rarely had before. Just two siblings sharing a meal and conversation, neither dominant nor subservient, just equal. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "Mom and Dad are adjusting, to the new you." She smiled. "It's good for them. Probably should have happened years ago." "And you?" I asked. "How are you adjusting?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm discovering my brother is actually a person, not just a function." "It's nice." She touched my arm briefly. "I like who you're becoming, Nate." Her words stayed with me long after she left, a reminder that the changes in my life weren't just external, new house, new career path, but internal as well. I was becoming someone different, someone who demanded respect rather than merely hoping for it. March arrived with the beginning of construction on the warehouse project. Seeing my designs take physical form was a different kind of satisfaction than I had experienced in my previous job, where my work was always filtered through layers of supervisors and committees, often emerging unrecognizable from my original vision. The responsibility was correspondingly greater. Every decision, every specification was mine to defend or adjust. When problems arose, as they inevitably did in construction, I couldn't pass them up the chain for resolution. I had to solve them, often on the spot, balancing creative integrity against practical constraints. It was during one such crisis, a structural issue that threatened to compromise a key design element, that I found myself working side by side with Uncle Thomas for the first time since his business failure. He had been assigned to my project as a liaison, his experience with difficult renovations making him valuable despite our complicated personal history. "The support beam can't go there," he said, pointing to my blueprint spread across the makeshift table at the construction site. "Not with the condition of that load-bearing wall." I studied the problem, dust from the demolition settling on my jacket. "If we move it, we lose the open flow of the space. The whole concept depends on that sight line." He frowned, considering. "What if we reinforce from above instead? Suspend rather than support?" The suggestion was insightful, drawing on his years of practical experience. Would that work with the ceiling height restrictions? He did some quick calculations on a scrap of paper. Tight, but doable. More expensive, though. "I'll make it work in the budget," I decided, The design integrity is worth it. He nodded, a hint of newfound respect in his expression. Your call. I'll get the engineers to rework the specs. As he walked away, I reflected on the subtle shift in our interaction. He had offered his expertise without condescension, respected my decision without challenge. It was a professional exchange between equals, something I had never experienced with him before. Later that week, as construction progressed, he approached me during a site inspection. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble as we stood, watching workers install the suspended support system we had designed together. I turned to him, surprised by the unexpected statement. For the business investment situation, he clarified. I wasn't honest about the company's position. I was desperate, and I targeted you because you've always been responsible with money. His directness was unprecedented in our family, where conflicts typically went unaddressed, smoothed over with platitudes about family loyalty rather than confronted honestly. I appreciate the apology, I said. It couldn't have been easy to admit that. He shrugged, eyes on the construction rather than on me. Losing everything has a way of adjusting your perspective. Pride seems less important when you're starting over at 55. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the building transform around us. You were right to refuse, he added. It would have been good money after bad. I just couldn't see it then. His acknowledgement was powerful not because I needed validation for my decision, but because it represented a fundamental change in how he viewed me, not as the family utility player to be used when convenient, but as someone whose judgment deserved respect. How are you doing now? I asked. Really? He considered the question, seemingly weighing honesty against pride. Better than I expected, he admitted. The smaller house is actually easier to maintain. Working for Dawson is less stressful than running my own business. Miranda is happier with me home at reasonable hours. He glanced at me. Sometimes what feels like failure turns out to be redirection. His words resonated with my own experience over the past year. How what had initially felt like rejection and betrayal had ultimately pushed me toward a more authentic life. I know exactly what you mean, I replied. April brought the first signs of spring, and with it, a revitalization of my social life that had been dormant during the intense first months of my partnership with Dawson. With the warehouse project well underway, I could finally come up for air, reconnecting with friends and exploring the community around my new home. I joined a local business owners association, finding unexpected camaraderie among other entrepreneurs who understood the particular challenges of building something from scratch. Among them was Elena, who owned a small interior design firm specializing in sustainable materials, a perfect complement to my architectural focus on environmentally conscious structures. Our professional connection quickly evolved into friendship, and then, tentatively, something more. Unlike previous relationships where I had often made myself smaller to accommodate someone else's needs, a pattern learned in my family, with Elena, I felt no pressure to be anything other than authentically myself. I like that you know what you want, she told me one evening as we walked through the nearly completed warehouse project after the construction crew had left for the day. So many people I meet are still trying to figure that out. It's relatively new for me, I admitted, showing her the innovative lighting system we had designed to minimize energy use. A year ago, I was still living my life according to other people's expectations. She studied me with interest. What changed? I considered the question, trying to pinpoint the exact moment of transformation. I got tired of being treated like a child when it was convenient for others, then expected to handle adult responsibilities when that was convenient too. The kids' table, she said with immediate understanding, metaphorically speaking. And literally, I added with a smile, explaining the Thanksgiving incident that had catalyzed so much change. She nodded, leaning against an exposed brick. Well, family systems are powerful. Breaking out of assigned roles takes courage. Her understanding was refreshing. No dismissal of my experience as trivial. No suggestion that family loyalty should trump personal growth. "What about your family?" I asked as we continued our tour of the building. "Loud, chaotic, and perpetually running late," she said with affection, "but fundamentally respectful of each other. I was lucky that way." Her words made me reflect on what healthy family dynamics could look like. Not perfect, not without conflict, but grounded in mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchies. As April turned to May, the warehouse project neared completion. The transformation was remarkable, from decaying industrial space to vibrant mixed-use building, with apartments that sold before they were finished and commercial spaces leased by innovative small businesses. The grand opening was scheduled for late May, with local press invited to cover the ribbon cutting. It would be my first major public exposure as Dawson's partner, a significant milestone in my new career path. A week before the event, I received an unexpected call from my father. "Your mother and I were wondering," he began awkwardly, "if you'd like us to attend the opening of your building project." The request surprised me. My parents had shown polite interest in my work, but had never before asked to participate in professional events. "I'd like that," I said after a moment's consideration. "It's this Saturday at noon, business casual dress." "We'll be there," he promised. "Your sister mentioned it's quite impressive what you've done with the old Hartman warehouse." The fact that Eliza had been speaking positively about my work to our parents was itself a noteworthy development, further evidence of the shifting family dynamics. The morning of the opening dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. I arrived early, checking final details and coordinating with the event staff Dawson had hired. The building looked even better than I had envisioned, the modern additions harmonizing with the historic elements we had preserved, the sustainable features integrated seamlessly into the design. As guests began to arrive, city officials, business owners, prospective tenants, local media, I spotted my family entering the courtyard. Not just my parents, but Eliza, Uncle Thomas, and Aunt Miranda, and my grandmother, all dressed for the occasion and moving as a group toward the gathering area. My mother reached me first, embracing me with genuine warmth. "This is magnificent, Nathan," she said, gesturing to the building. "Truly impressive." My father, less demonstrative but equally sincere, shook my hand firmly. "Excellent work, son. Really excellent." The approval in his voice was unmistakable, not the grudging acknowledgement I had sometimes received in the past, but real pride and respect. Graham patted my cheek affectionately. "I knew you could do it," she said simply. "I always knew." As the ceremony began, my family took seats in the front row, their presence a visible endorsement of my professional accomplishment. Dawson spoke, first, praising the vision and technical expertise I had brought to the project. The mayor followed, emphasizing the building's contribution to urban renewal and sustainability goals. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself looking directly at my family as I described the philosophy behind the design, the balance of preservation and innovation, the commitment to sustainability, the focus on creating spaces that enhanced community connection. Architecture isn't just about buildings, I concluded. It's about creating environments where people can thrive, where they can be their best and truest selves. That's what we've aimed for here. A space that respects the past while embracing future possibilities, that honors tradition while making room for growth and change. As applause followed my remarks, I saw something in my parents' eyes I had rarely noticed before. Not just approval, but understanding. Perhaps for the first time, they were seeing me not as the reliable son who existed primarily to fulfill family needs, but as a fully realized individual with unique gifts and vision. The ribbon cutting followed, with photographers capturing the moment for local papers and business publications. In those images, published the following week, I would stand surrounded by officials and business partners, but also by my family, their presence a visual representation of our evolving relationship. After the ceremony, as guests toured the building and enjoyed the reception, Elena joined our family circle, her easy confidence and professional insight earning immediate respect from my parents and admiration from Eliza. Watching them interact, I felt a sense of worlds merging. My professional self, my personal self, my family self no longer compartmentalized, but integrated into a coherent whole. Later, as the event wound down, my father drew me aside. "I'm proud of you," he said. The words clearly difficult for him, but all the more meaningful for that difficulty. "Not just for this," he gestured to the building. "Though it's remarkable, I'm proud of who you've become." Coming from him, a man of few words and fewer emotional expressions, the statement held extraordinary weight. "Thank you," I replied, simply. "That means a lot." He nodded, uncomfortable with the emotional moment, but committed to seeing it through. "Your mother and we haven't always understood you, or appreciated what you bring to the family." He cleared his throat. "We're trying to do better." It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a tearful apology, but from my father, it was significant. Acknowledgement of past failures and commitment to future improvement. As my family prepared to leave, Graham held back, letting the others walk ahead, to their cars. "Well done," she said, linking her arm through mine as we strolled through the courtyard. "And I don't just mean the building." I smiled down at her. "I know. You've changed them," she observed. "By changing yourself, by refusing to accept the role they assigned you, you've forced them to see you differently." Her insight, as always, cut straight to the heart of the matter. "It's still a work in progress," I admitted. "Families always are," she replied with the wisdom of her years. "But the direction matters more than the destination." As I watched my family drive away, not in anger or estrangement as I had once feared might be necessary, but with newfound respect and recognition, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with buildings or career, milestones. I had built something more important than any physical structure, a life defined by my own values rather than others' expectations, relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenience, boundaries that protected without isolating. Standing in the shadow of the building that represented my professional rebirth, I reflected on the journey of the past year. From the kids' table to the architect's podium, from family afterthought to respected individual, from accepting what was offered to creating what I desired. The transformation wasn't complete, real growth never is, but the foundation was solid, the structure sound, the design authentic to who I truly was. Like the warehouse we had reimagined, preserving what was valuable while discarding what no longer served, I had reconstructed my life according to my own blueprint, creating space for both heritage and possibility, for roots and wings. The successful warehouse project catapulted our firm into a new tier of recognition. Architectural magazines featured it in spreads about urban renewal, and potential clients began reaching out specifically asking for the Dawson Reed approach to sustainable design. It was surreal seeing my name paired with Dawson's in industry publications, my vision validated in a way I'd never experienced before. By midsummer, we had secured 3 major new projects and expanded our staff to handle the workload. I found myself in the unexpected position of leading a team, mentoring junior architects who looked to me for guidance, a stark contrast to my previous role as the reliable but overlooked team member at my old firm. One particularly hot July afternoon, as I reviewed applications for another design position, Dawson dropped by my office, looking unusually formal in a suit despite the heat. "Got a minute?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Of course," I replied, setting aside the resumes. He sat heavily in the chair across from my desk, loosening his tie. "Just came from a meeting with Meridian Development Group." I raised an eyebrow. Meridian was one of the largest developers in the region, known for high-profile projects and deep pockets. We had submitted a proposal for their new mixed-use downtown complex 6 weeks earlier, but had been told we were long shots against the established architectural giants also bidding. They loved the warehouse, Dawson continued, toured it twice, asked a lot of questions about sustainable design integration, community spaces. And, I prompted, not daring to hope. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. They want us, Nathan. Full design contract, creative control, budget approval. The works. I sat back, stunned. That's huge, Jim. Life-changing, he agreed. For both of us. This is the kind of project that defines a career. The Meridian development would be 20 times the scale of the warehouse. Multiple buildings, residential and commercial space, public plazas, all designed with sustainability as a central focus rather than an afterthought. It represented exactly the kind of work I had always dreamed of, but never thought I'd have the opportunity to lead. There's something else, Dawson said, sliding a document across my desk. According to our agreement, we reevaluate partnership terms after 2 years. We're only at 1 year, but with this contract. He tapped the document. I'm proposing an accelerated timeline, equal partnership starting immediately. I stared at the partnership amendment, processing what this meant. In just 1 year, I had gone from mid-level architect at a conventional firm to equal partner in a rapidly growing, innovative practice doing meaningful work at a scale I had never imagined possible so early in my career. I don't know what to say, I admitted. Say yes, Dawson replied simply. You've earned it. The warehouse was all you, your vision, your problem-solving, your relationships with the contractors. I just provided the opportunity. The rest was you. That evening, I invited Elena to dinner to celebrate. Over the past months, our relationship had deepened into something solid and nurturing, built on mutual respect and genuine admiration for each other's work and character. To equal partnership, she toasted, raising her glass in the candlelight. And the Meridian Project. I'm so proud of you, Nathan. I can hardly believe it's happening, I confessed. A year ago, I was designing bathroom renovations and office cubicle layouts, grateful for any creative input I was allowed to have. She reached across the table and took my hand. That's what happens when you refuse to stay at the kids' table. Metaphorically and literally, you create space for your true capabilities to emerge. After dinner, walking through the summer evening toward the riverfront, Elena broached a topic we had been circling for weeks. I've been thinking, she said, her fingers laced through mine. With my lease ending next month and us spending most nights together anyway. Are you suggesting what I think you are? I asked, stopping to face her. She smiled, a hint of uncertainty behind her usual confidence. Moving in together is a big step. I just thought, with your house having the extra bedroom for my office, and the way our schedules align so well. I pulled her close. Yes, I said simply. Absolutely, yes. The decision felt right. Not impulsive, but natural. An authentic progression of our relationship rather than a box to be checked or an obligation to fulfill. Unlike so many of my past choices, this one came from a place of desire rather than duty, of possibility rather than pressure. August brought the official signing of the Meridian contract and the beginning of Elena moving her things into my house. Watching our possessions integrate, her colorful textiles softening my more minimalist aesthetic, her extensive cookbook collection filling shelves alongside my architectural volumes, I reflected on how different this felt from any previous relationship. I had always been the accommodating one, the one who compromised, who adjusted, who made room. With Elena, there was a natural give and take, each of us maintaining our individuality while creating something new together. As the moving process Neared completion, Elena suggested a housewarming dinner with both our families, her parents and brother from Chicago, my parents, Eliza, and Graham. The idea was both appealing and intimidating. Our families had met briefly at gallery openings and casual gatherings, but never for an extended, intimate dinner. "Are you sure?" I asked as we discussed the guest list. "My family can be complicated." She laughed, sorting through kitchen tools to decide what to keep and what to donate. "All families are complicated, Nathan, mine included, but they're making an effort now, right? And I think it would be meaningful, officially introducing them to our shared home, to this new chapter." Her perspective helped ease my concerns. This wasn't about seeking approval or orchestrating a perfect family gathering. It was simply about sharing our joy with those who mattered to us, awkwardness and history and all. The dinner was scheduled for the last weekend in August, when summer heat still lingered, but evening breezes made outdoor dining pleasant. Elena and I spent the day preparing, shopping at the farmer's market for fresh ingredients, setting up the patio with string lights and flowers, collaborating on dishes that represented both our family traditions. When the doorbell rang, I felt an unexpected flutter of nerves. Elena squeezed my hand before going to welcome her family, who had arrived first. Her father, Franco, a retired professor with a booming laugh, her mother, Sophia, warm and direct with flecks of gray in her dark hair, and her younger brother, Marco, a musician with perpetually tousled hair, filled our entryway with enthusiastic greetings and the scent of the pastries they had brought. 30 minutes later, my family arrived. My parents seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, bearing a bottle of wine and a houseplant. Eliza followed with Graham, who immediately broke the tension by declaring, "So this is where all the fuss is about. Show me everything, Nathan." The initial awkwardness between the families dissolved quickly over appetizers and drinks. Elena's father and mine discovered a shared interest in vintage cars, while her mother and mine exchanged gardening tips. Eliza and Marco fell into animated conversation about music venues in the city. Watching them all interact, these people, from different worlds, different family cultures, I felt a profound sense of integration. The compartmentalization that had defined so much of my life was giving way to something more organic, more whole. As we settled around the patio table for dinner, my father surprised me by asking to say a few words. He stood, wine glass in hand, looking more emotional than I had seen him in years. "I want to toast Nathan and Elena," he began, his voice gruff with feeling. "Not just for this beautiful home you've created together, but for the way you've both built your lives on your own terms." He glanced at me, eyes shining. "Nathan, your mother and I haven't always understood the choices you've made or recognized the strength it took to make them. But seeing you now, the success you've achieved, the partnership you've found, the person you've become, we couldn't be prouder." The words washed over me like a healing balm. From my father, a man of few emotional expressions, this public acknowledgement represented a profound shift. "To Nathan and Elena," he concluded, raising his glass, "may your home be filled with the respect and recognition you both deserve." Everyone lifted their glasses, the moment weightier than a typical toast charged with the history and growth it represented. Later, as we served dessert, a fusion of Elena's family's traditional Italian pastries and my grandmother's berry cobbler recipe, Graham pulled me aside. "You've done it," she said, patting my hand. "Created a life that reflects who you truly are, not who others needed you to be." I smiled, watching Elena laugh with Eliza across the patio. "I had good guidance." She shook her head. "I just named what you already knew deep down. You did the hard work of changing the narrative." As the evening wound down, conversations blending and shifting across the patio, I found myself standing, slightly apart, taking in the scene with a sense of wonderment. Here was my family, not perfect, still learning but evolving, breaking bread with the family of the woman I loved, in a home we had intentionally created together, discussing the work I had fought to make meaningful. It was more than I had allowed myself to envision when I first walked away from that kids' table, when I first began to question the role I had been assigned in my family's story. The Meridian project moved into high gear as fall approached. I assembled a dedicated team within our firm, including 2 promising young architects who reminded me of myself a decade earlier, full of innovative ideas, but lacking the confidence or opportunity to express them. I made a conscious effort to mentor them differently than I had been mentored, to create space for their creativity while providing the guidance they needed to translate vision into viable design. One of them, Zoe, approached me after a particularly productive design session in late September. "I have to tell you something," she said as we packed up materials from the conference room. "I almost didn't apply for this position." "Why not?" I asked, surprised. Her portfolio had been exceptional, her interview impressive. She hesitated. "I had an internship at Belmore and Associates after graduation. They weren't receptive to my ideas about sustainable integration, said I needed to learn the basics before suggesting innovations." She smiled ruefully. 3 years filing paperwork and making coffee didn't feel very basic to me. I recognized the story. The talented newcomer whose creativity was stifled by established hierarchies, whose contributions were dismissed as naivety rather than recognized as fresh perspective. "What changed your mind about applying here?" I asked. "The warehouse project," she replied immediately. "I toured it during the open house. The guide mentioned you were only a year into partnership with Dawson when you designed it, that you'd come from a traditional firm where you hadn't been able to pursue this kind of work." She shrugged. It gave me hope that maybe there was a place for my approach after all. Her words hit me with unexpected force. The realization that my journey had meaning beyond my own growth, that in breaking out of the constraints others had placed on me, I was helping create opportunity for others to do the same. "I'm glad you applied," I told her sincerely. "And I'm even more glad you told me this. It's important to remember why we're approaching design differently, why it matters to create space for new voices." The conversation stayed with me, catalyzing a new dimension to our work on the Meridian project. Beyond the technical aspects of sustainable design, beyond the aesthetic and functional considerations, we began explicitly incorporating principles of inclusivity and empowerment into our process, ensuring diverse perspectives were not just heard but integrated, that hierarchy served efficiency rather than reinforcing power imbalances. By October, preliminary designs were ready to present to Meridian's board. The night before the presentation, I worked late at the office, fine-tuning visual elements and rehearsing key points. I was so absorbed that I didn't notice Uncle Thomas enter until he placed a coffee on my desk. "Thought you could use this," he said, settling into a chair across from me. "Dawson mentioned the big presentation tomorrow." "Thanks," I replied, surprised by the thoughtful gesture. Our relationship had improved dramatically over the past year, evolving from the tense dynamic of our past to something approaching mutual respect, but small kindnesses like this were still unexpected. He glanced at the presentation materials, spread across my desk. "Impressive scale. Biggest project the firm has ever taken on?" I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. Prepared exactly as I liked it, I noticed. "It's a big responsibility." "You can handle it," he said with a certainty that would have seemed patronizing a year ago, but now felt like genuine confidence in my abilities. "You've got a vision most people in this industry lack." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the late-night office quiet around us. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he said finally. "A proposition." I tensed slightly, memories of his failed business investment request surfacing despite our improved relationship. Noticing my reaction, he smiled wryly. "Not that kind of proposition. I've learned my lesson about financial entanglements." He leaned forward. "It's about education. The community college has asked me to develop a course on practical applications of sustainable building techniques, hands-on training for contractors, builders, project managers. That's great, I said, genuinely pleased for him. You have so much practical knowledge to share. He nodded. But I'm not an architect. I understand the execution, but not the design principles behind it. He met my gaze directly. I thought maybe we could co-teach. You handle the design theory, sustainability concepts, integration approaches. I cover the practical implementation, material considerations, construction challenges. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. A year ago, the idea of standing as an equal beside Uncle Thomas, of being acknowledged as having expertise he lacked, would have seemed impossible. It would only be one evening a week for a semester, he added. I know you're busy with Meridian and the firm, but I think we could offer something unique together, bridging theory and practice in a way most courses don't. I considered the proposal, surprised by how appealing it was, not just professionally, but personally. Teaching alongside Uncle Thomas represented a full-circle moment, a completion of the journey from family afterthought to recognized equal. I'd like that, I said. Let's discuss details after the Meridian presentation. He stood, clearly pleased. Good luck tomorrow. Though you won't need it. What you've designed speaks for itself. After he left, I sat reflecting on the interaction. There had been no hint of the old dynamic, no condescension, no assumption that his experience automatically trumped my knowledge, no positioning of himself as the authority and me as the assistant. Instead, there had been recognition of complementary strengths, of mutual value, of equal but different contributions. The Meridian presentation the next day exceeded even my highest hopes. The board's response was enthusiastic, with several members specifically commenting on the innovative integration of sustainability features and community-centered design elements. We left with full approval to proceed and an accelerated timeline that would make the project the centerpiece of the firm's portfolio. Driving home afterward, exhilarated by the success, but exhausted from weeks of preparation, I found myself thinking not about the professional milestone, but about the personal journey that had made it possible. If I had remained in my assigned role, the reliable one, the helpful one, the one who accommodated rather than challenged, I would never have created the space for my true capabilities to emerge. Elena was waiting when I arrived home, having prepared a celebratory dinner despite her own busy schedule. As we shared the meal, discussing the presentation and the board's response, I was struck by the ease between us. The natural flow of support and challenge, of listening and being heard, of standing beside rather than behind. I've been thinking, I said as we lingered over dessert, about family patterns and how they shape us. She nodded, intrigued by the direction of the conversation. In what way? When I first stood up against being seated at the kids' table, I was focused on the immediate issue, the symbolic demotion, the lack of respect. But looking back, it was about something deeper. The role you had been assigned in your family system, she suggested. Exactly. The expectation that I would always accommodate, always adjust, always put others' needs before my own. That I would accept less because asking for more was selfish or difficult. Elena reached across the table to take my hand. Breaking. Patterns is hard work, especially ones established in childhood. It is, I agreed. But what I'm realizing is that it's not just about standing up for yourself in the moment. It's about consciously creating new patterns, in relationships, in work, in how you move through the world. She smiled, understanding immediately. Like mentoring those young architects differently than you were mentored. Like building a relationship where both people have equal voice and value. Like co-teaching with Uncle Thomas as an equal rather than accepting the role of assistant, I added, telling her about his unexpected proposal. As our conversation continued, flowing from the personal to the professional and back again, I recognized how thoroughly integrated my life had become. Work and family, past and present, individual growth and relationship building, all informing and enhancing each other rather than competing for space or priority. Thanksgiving approached with none of the dread I had felt the previous year. Instead, I found myself looking forward to the gathering, curious to experience it from my new perspective, not as someone seeking validation or bracing for disappointment, but as someone secure in their own worth regardless of family dynamics. Elena and I had been invited to host, our home being the most spacious and central. We agreed readily, seeing an opportunity to establish new traditions that reflected our values and accommodated all family members equitably. The week before the holiday, my mother called, ostensibly to discuss menu coordination, but clearly with something else on her mind. About seating arrangements, she said finally, after we had sorted out who would bring which dishes. Your father and I were thinking, maybe we could do away with the separate kids' table this year. Have everyone at one long table instead. The suggestion, so simple yet so profound in what it represented, momentarily left me speechless. Nathan, are you there? She prompted after my prolonged silence. Yes, I managed. That's a great idea, Mom. One table for everyone. We thought so too, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. It's time for some new traditions, don't you think? After we hung up, I sat on the porch swing, processing the conversation. My mother's suggestion wasn't just about practical seating arrangements, it was an acknowledgement of the harmful hierarchy the separate tables had reinforced, a recognition that respect shouldn't be allocated based on age or status, but extended to all family members equally. Elena found me still sitting there, lost in thought when she returned from her studio. Good news or bad news? She asked, noting my pensive expression as she joined me on the swing. Transformative news, I replied, explaining my mother's suggestion. It might seem small to someone else, but knowing my family's history, it's huge, she agreed, resting her head on my shoulder. It means they've really heard you, not just accommodated you. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and bright, the late November sun casting long shadows across our backyard where Elena and I had set up one long table, beautifully appointed with a blend of items from both our families. Her grandmother's tablecloth, my grandfather's carved candle holders, place cards made by her young nieces. As family members arrived, my parents and grandmother, Eliza with her new boyfriend, Uncle Thomas and Aunt Miranda, Elena's parents and brother who had decided to join us rather than host their own celebration in Chicago. The atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming. There was none of the tension I had come to associate with family gatherings, no undercurrent of resentment or hidden hierarchies. When it was time to be seated, I watched with quiet joy as everyone found their places around the single table. Adults and teenagers, my family and Elena's, all integrated as equals in the shared space. My mother had even seated herself next to Elena's father, engaged in animated conversation about their shared interest in historical preservation. Before the meal began, Graham asked to say a few words. Standing with the dignity of her years, she surveyed the gathered family. I want to acknowledge the significance of this moment, she said. Not just a holiday, not just a blending of families, but a transformation of how we relate to one another. She smiled at me. Sometimes it takes courage to question the way things have always been, to ask for the respect you deserve rather than the role you've been assigned. Her words traveled around the table, landing differently with each person, but resonating with the journey we had taken as a family over the past year. To new traditions, she concluded, raising her glass. And to the wisdom to know, when old, ones no longer serve us. As we shared the meal, dishes from both family traditions alongside new recipes Elena and I had created together, I observed the natural flow of conversation around the table. My teenage cousins contributed to discussions, About current events, their perspectives valued rather than dismissed. Eliza and Uncle Thomas engaged in thoughtful debate about local development policies without either dominating the conversation. My parents asked Elena detailed questions about her design work, showing genuine interest in her creative process. It was, in many ways, an ordinary family Thanksgiving, complete with momentary awkwardness, occasional conversational lulls, and too much food. But the ordinariness itself was extraordinary, the lack of tension or hierarchy a testament to how far we had come. After dessert, as family members dispersed throughout the house and yard in smaller conversational groups, my father found me in the kitchen where I was brewing coffee. "This was good," he said simply, leaning against the counter beside me. "Different, but good." "I thought so too," I agreed, arranging cups on a tray. He was quiet for a moment, watching the coffee drip. "I've been thinking a lot about patterns lately, how we repeat what we've experienced without questioning it." He glanced at me. When I was a boy, children were seen and not heard at family gatherings. Always the separate table, never included in adult conversation. It was the most he had ever shared about his own childhood, offering context for patterns I had always experienced as personal rather than generational. "It didn't occur to me to do things differently," he continued, "not until you forced the issue." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes it takes the next generation to show us a better way." The admission, humble, straightforward, devoid of defensiveness, moved me deeply. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." He nodded, uncomfortable with emotional moments as always, but committed to authentic communication in a way I had rarely seen from him. "You and Elena have created something special here," he said, gesturing to encompass the house, the gathered family, the new traditions. "Something worth learning from." As the day wound down and family members gradually departed with leftovers and warm goodbyes, I found myself standing in the doorway with Elena, watching taillights disappear down our street. "Well," she said, leaning into my side, "that was a success." "Beyond what I could have imagined," I agreed. "Not perfect, but real, respectful." She smiled up at me. "From the kids' table to hosting the whole family as equals. Quite a journey in 1 year." Later that night, as we sat on the porch swing again, watching stars emerge in the clear November sky, I reflected on the distance traveled, not just in family dynamics or career achievements, but in my understanding of my own worth and capacity. The journey had begun with a single moment of clarity, a refusal to accept less than I deserved. It had continued through difficult conversations, through establishing boundaries, through creating space for my authentic self to emerge and be recognized. It had led to this moment, a life aligned with my values, relationships built on mutual respect, work that expressed my true capabilities. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, noting my contemplative silence. "How sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay at the kids' table," I replied, metaphorically and literally. She nodded, understanding as she always did the layers of meaning in the statement, and how that refusal creates ripples that transform not just your life but the lives of those around you. As we sat together in the quiet evening, I felt a deep sense of peace. Not the passive acceptance of assigned roles that I had once mistaken for family harmony, but the genuine contentment that comes from living authentically, from being recognized for who you truly are, rather than who others need you to be. From a distance, the change might have seemed small, a seating arrangement, a family dinner, ordinary moments of recognition and respect. But within those seemingly small shifts lay the most profound transformation of all, the reclamation of personal dignity, the courage to define one's own place in the world, the wisdom to create new patterns rather than perpetuate harmful ones. In refusing to remain at the kids' table, I had found not just a better seat, but a better way of being, one that honored both my heritage and my potential. my connections to others and my commitment to myself, my past experiences and my future possibilities. And in that balance, hard-won, consciously maintained, continuously evolving, lay the true meaning of growing up. Not an age or a status or a position at the table, but the courage to stand firmly in your own worth while creating space for others to do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.